Picture a farmhouse in the Bavarian countryside in the mid-1950s. The air smells of damp soil and livestock. A man in mud-caked boots walks out at dawn to check on his pigs, his breath rising in little clouds against the cold morning air. His neighbors have known him for nearly a decade. They like him. He is dependable, even-tempered, polite in that understated way that rural communities tend to respect. He doesn't say much about the war. But then, almost nobody in Germany did. He is called Karl by the people around him. Though that's not his real name. He fixes things when they break, shows up when neighbors need help with the harvest, and sits quietly at the back of the church on Sunday mornings. He has no wife, but there is a woman he sees, a widow, whose husband died in the last years of the war. She doesn't ask him many questions. He doesn't offer many answers. The thing that she notices, the one thing she cannot quite explain away, is that sometimes, in the middle of the night, he screams, not nightmares in the gentle sense, not the restless turning of a man reliving something uncomfortable. These are raw, animal sounds. And in the morning, when she asks him what he dreamed, he says nothing. He just puts on his boots and goes out to the barn. We'll come back to what he was screaming about, because what this man had done, what he was screaming about in those pre-dawn hours, alone in a farmhouse in the Bavarian countryside, is the subject of this video, and it is not a comfortable subject. This is a story about how ordinary life can coexist with extraordinary evil. It's a story about justice, about the people who refuse to forget, and about what it actually takes, what it costs, to make sure that monsters who dress themselves in mud and routine don't simply walk away clean. Part 2. The world that made him. To understand how a man arrives at the place where Karl arrived, you have to go back to the world that produced him. Not to excuse it, to explain it. Because that world was specific, and the conditions it created were real, and the story doesn't make sense without them. He was born in the early years of the 20th century in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That vast, creaking structure of languages and loyalties that crumbled apart in 1918 and left millions of people without a stable sense of who they were or what their world meant. His background was unremarkable: a modest family, a civil servant father, a mother who kept the household together. They were not wealthy, not prominent, not particularly political. But then came the First World War, which took relatives and left grief. Then came the armistice, which took national pride and left humiliation. Then came the Versailles Treaty, which the German-speaking world experienced not as a peace settlement, but as a punishment, a deliberate act of humiliation by powers that had simply outmaneuvered them. Then came the hyperinflation of the early 1920s, which destroyed savings overnight and made middle-class families feel the particular shame of genteel poverty, of having to watch everything their parents had built simply evaporate. That specific sequence, war, humiliation, economic collapse, identity crisis, created the conditions in which the National Socialist movement grew. Not because it was inevitable, not because every German or Austrian who suffered through those years became a Nazi, but because the Nazi Party was extraordinarily skilled at giving people a framework for their resentment, an explanation for their suffering, a target for their anger, and a promise of restoration. The Hitler Youth enrolled millions of young people during the 1930s, and Karl would have been among them. A teenager in a movement that offered meaning, belonging, and a sense of heroic mission in a world that otherwise felt precarious and small. By the time he was a young man in his 20s, the ideology wasn't something he had chosen at a distance. It had shaped him from the inside. It was the water he had learned to swim in. He applied to join the SS, the Schutzstaffel, in the mid-1930s when that organization was rapidly expanding. And this is where the story gets specific and important. The SS was not simply a military force. Heinrich Himmler had designed it as an ideological elite. Entry required proof of racial purity, stretching back multiple generations. Members were expected to embody the Nazi vision of the Germanic man, disciplined, loyal, ideologically committed, and prepared to do whatever the regime required. To be accepted was, in the warped logic of that world, an honor. He was accepted. He rose through the ranks steadily. And in 1941 he was assigned to the General Government Territory in occupied Poland, the region where, at precisely that moment, the theoretical racism of Nazi ideology was becoming something far more concrete and far more lethal. Part 3. The camp, the forced labor camp, system in occupied Poland operated on a logic that was economic on its surface and murderous underneath. Jews and Poles who were deemed capable of contributing to the German war economy were put to work in factories, quarries, and construction projects. They were fed just enough to remain physically functional. When they stopped being functional, they were disposed of. The camp that Karl commanded sat in the Krakow district of occupied Poland, one of dozens of such facilities scattered across the region. At its peak, it held somewhere between 800 and 1,200 prisoners. They worked shifts in an adjacent munitions facility, 12 hours at a stretch, returning to overcrowded barracks with insufficient food and no medical care. Disease was constant. Malnutrition was constant. The gap between life and death was narrow and growing narrower every month. What distinguished commanders like Karl from the administrative machinery that surrounded them was the exercise of personal discretion. This is something the historical record makes clear across multiple documented cases, including real figures like Josef Schwamberger, an SS lieutenant who commanded 3 forced labor camps in the Krakow district between 1942 and 1944, and who was later convicted of 7 counts of murder and 32 counts of accessory to murder. Witnesses at his trial said they had seen him throw prisoners onto bonfires, kill Jews kneeling beside mass graves, and slam children's heads against walls. Another figure from the same region and period, Amon Goeth, commandant of the Krakow-Płaszów concentration camp, was, as survivors described him, prone to sudden explosions of personal violence, shooting people from his office window if they appeared to be moving too slowly or resting in the yard. The pattern across these documented cases is consistent and chilling. These were not men who merely administered death at a bureaucratic remove. They were men who made it personal. Karl's camp practiced what historians of the Holocaust came to call selections, periodic reviews of the prisoner population during which the sick, the elderly, or those who had simply exhausted their usefulness were separated from the general population and killed. Some were shot in the forests adjacent to the camp. Others were loaded onto transport and sent to the larger extermination facilities to the east, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor. There they disappeared into machinery designed for the single purpose of industrial murder. Between 1941 and the final months of the war, the camp under Karl's command was responsible for hundreds of deaths, some directly, some through the catastrophic conditions he administered, some through the selections he ordered or oversaw. He was 29 years old when this began. Sit with that for a moment. 29 years old, and what he was doing was not secret. was not done in anguish or reluctance, was not the product of coercion. The documentary record of SS camps consistently shows men who had operational choices, who could calibrate the level of violence, who could choose to turn away or look closer, and who consistently chose the maximum. This was not a machine with no human operators. The operators were there, choosing every day. Part 4. The Collapse. By the summer of 1944, Germany was losing the war, and everyone involved in running the camp system knew what that meant. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944 had opened a Western front that now ground forward with unstoppable momentum. The Soviet armies were advancing from the east with devastating speed and power. The industrial cities of the Reich were being systematically reduced to rubble by Allied air power. The dream of the 1,000-year empire was dissolving in real time, and the men who had run the apparatus of mass murder could now see, with terrible clarity, what would happen when it finally fell. They knew what they had done, and they understood that a reckoning was coming. In the final months of the war, the Nazi leadership launched desperate efforts to destroy evidence. Camp records were burned. Mass graves were exhumed, sometimes using prisoner labor to do the exhuming, and the bodies cremated. The goal was to make it look as if the camps had never existed, to transform physical evidence into ash and smoke before the Allied forces arrived to find it. And then there were the prisoners themselves, the most damaging witnesses of all. As Soviet forces advanced westward, tens of thousands of concentration camp and forced labor camp prisoners were forced onto what became known as death marches. Columns of emaciated men and women, many already barely alive, were driven down winter roads away from the liberating armies, guarded by SS troops who shot anyone who fell behind. Tens of thousands died on those roads. From exhaustion, from cold, from hunger, and from bullets. Karl oversaw one such evacuation in the winter of 1944 to 1945. The numbers from documented cases like Schwamberger's give a sense of the scale. Of hundreds of prisoners who left on such marches, massive proportions never survived to see liberation. The march itself was, in many cases, simply the final phase of the killing. Germany surrendered in May 1945. The SS was declared a criminal organization by the Nuremberg Tribunal. Every member faced at minimum investigation and possible prosecution. For high-ranking or notorious officers, the danger was immediate and acute. For mid-level figures like Karl, not famous enough to appear on the major Allied target lists, but attached to too many deaths to feel safe, the question was simple and urgent. What do you do now? The answer he chose was the one chosen by thousands of others in his position. He vanished. Part 5. The Escape Networks. The chaos of post-war Europe was, for men in Karl's situation, simultaneously terrifying and opportune. Millions of people had been displaced. Borders were fluid. Record systems had been shattered by Allied bombs, by Nazi efforts at evidence destruction, by simple administrative collapse. The Allied occupation authorities were processing enormous numbers of Germans and Austrians every day, and their intelligence on mid-level SS officers was fragmentary. Several networks existed to help SS men escape justice. The most famous was the so-called Odessa, an abbreviation for the German phrase meaning organization of former SS members. Historians have debated the degree to which this was a single coordinated network versus a collection of overlapping, loosely organized efforts. What is more documented are the rat lines, escape routes that operated through Rome, often with the tacit or active support of certain Catholic Church officials and Nazi sympathizers, who provided forged documents, safe houses, and passage to South America. According to German prosecutors who examined secret files from Brazil and Chile, as many as 9,000 Nazi officers and collaborators escaped from Europe to find sanctuary in South American countries. By far the largest number, as many as 5,000, relocated to Argentina. They were helped by the fact that Argentina under Juan Perón was actively receptive. The Perón government established semi-official programs to recruit former Nazis, offering citizenship, employment, and protection from extradition. Among those who took these routes, Adolf Eichmann, one of the principal architects of the Holocaust, who boarded a steamship to Buenos Aires in 1950 under the alias Ricardo Clement and worked at a Mercedes-Benz plant for years. Josef Schwamberger, who commanded SS labor camps in the Krakow district, the same region as Karl, escaped to Argentina, where he lived under his own name and obtained citizenship. Josef Mengele fled to Argentina in 1949 and spent 3 decades in South America before dying in Chataín y Ars, 1979, never having faced justice. Karl's route was more modest. He did not have the resources or the connections for an ocean crossing. He did not flee to Argentina. Instead, he did something that was, in its own way, equally audacious in its simplicity. He went home. Not to his actual hometown, but to a village in the Bavarian countryside, close enough to familiar territory to feel navigable, far enough from his origins to provide a degree of anonymity. He arrived with a new name, a simple cover story. A Wehrmacht veteran, not SS, wounded on the Eastern Front, just a man wanting to be left alone, and a connection to a distant cousin with a farm that needed working. He did not flee across an ocean. He simply stepped sideways into ordinariness. Part 6. The Farmer. The farm needed him. Rural Bavaria in the years after the war was short of able-bodied men. The war had taken most of them. A quiet, capable person who could repair machinery, handle livestock, and didn't ask, for much was not a man you turned away, whatever questions might hover unspoken at the edge of your mind. And so Karl became a farmer. Within a year or two, he was simply Karl to everyone in the area. He learned the rhythms of agricultural life, the early mornings, the physical work, the cycle of planting and harvest and repair. He kept pigs. He had dairy cows. He was known for being reliable and honest in his dealings, for showing up when people needed help, for being quietly present at community events. He attended church. After the war, most ordinary Nazis, Gestapo agents, SS and SA auxiliaries, party members, and government officials faded into relative obscurity and were able to create fresh false identities and make a clean break with their pasts. They were aided by a silence within families and within the polity that persisted for decades. What enabled this was not just Karl's personal skill at concealment, but the broader social and institutional climate of post-war West Germany. The denazification process, however well-intentioned, was officially abolished in 1951. West Germany's first chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, was opposed to the process of denazification and instead opted for a strategy of integration, integrating old Nazis into the new republic in order to move forward. Ultimately, many of those involved in Nazi activities were not punished and retained their personal and professional positions. Between 1945 and 1958, only 6,093 former Nazis were convicted of having committed a crime. A drop in the ocean when we remember that in 1945, the Nazi Party had 8 million members. This wasn't simply institutional failure. It was something more cultural and more uncomfortable, a collective decision made by millions of ordinary Germans not to look too carefully, not to ask. The country was rebuilding. There were practical necessities everywhere. You couldn't run a school or a court or a civil administration if you excluded everyone with a Nazi-era past. Compromises were made, silences were kept. An entire society developed, almost as a reflex, the ability to not quite see what it was looking at. Karl fit perfectly into that willingness not to see. And yet, the screaming at night continued. This is perhaps the most unsettling detail in stories like this one, and it appears in multiple documented accounts of men who committed atrocities and then lived quietly in the years afterward. The surface performs normalcy. The body, in sleep, cannot maintain the performance. Survivors of men like Karl, women who lived with them or near them, have described again and again the same phenomenon. A person who was perfectly controlled during daylight, perfectly ordinary, who shattered in the dark. Think about what that means, really. In the mornings he fed animals and repaired fence posts. At night he screamed at things only he could see, and between those two facts he simply lived, functioned, passed. The question of how that is possible has fascinated psychologists, historians, and philosophers for decades. Can a person partition themselves that completely? Can the man who ordered the deaths of hundreds simply place that behind glass, somewhere in the architecture of the self, and operate normally around it? The evidence, across dozens of documented cases, suggests that yes, they can. Not easily, not without cost. But yes. Part 7. The Hunters. While Karl planted potatoes in Bavaria and attended Sunday Mass, other people were not forgetting. Simon Wiesenthal was an Austrian Jewish man who had survived multiple concentration camps: Janowska, Płaszów, Gross-Rosen, Buchenwald, Mauthausen. After liberation, he dedicated his life to tracking down and gathering information on fugitive Nazi war criminals so that they could be brought to trial. In 1947, he co-founded the Jewish Historical Documentation Center in Linz, Austria, where he and others gathered information for future war crime trials and aided Jewish refugees in their search for lost relatives. When asked why he had given up the prospect of a normal life to pursue this work, Wiesenthal reportedly said, "When we come to the other world and meet the millions of Jews who died in the camps, and they ask us, 'What have you done?' there will be many answers. You will say, 'I became a jeweler.' Another will say, 'I built houses.' But I will say, 'I didn't forget you.'" Wiesenthal's approach was methodical and patient. He culled every pertinent document and record he could obtain and listened to the many personal accounts told him by individual survivors. He pieced together the most obscure, incomplete, and apparently irrelevant data to build cases solid enough to stand up in a court of law. But Wiesenthal was working in a difficult political environment. During the 1950s, interest in prosecuting Nazi crimes diminished during the Cold War, and the surviving convicted perpetrators were set free. Many thousands of persons who had participated in the persecution and murder of innocent civilians did not face justice at all. The institutional breakthrough came in December 1958, 13 years after the end of the war, when the West German state justice ministries agreed to establish the Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes in Ludwigsburg. The Zentrale Stelle, as it was commonly known, was established to do a job that few in Germany wanted to do: track down Nazi criminals. It was the Ulm Einsatzkommando trial of 1958, prosecuting SS and Gestapo officers responsible for mass killings along the German-Lithuanian front. That revealed how badly such a coordinated body was needed. The mandate for the Central Office was to collect and examine all relevant records on criminal acts of the Nazi regime. The facts ascertained were then handed over to public prosecutors who instituted formal criminal proceedings. Since its formation, the Central Office helped track down and prosecute almost 7,000 Nazi criminals and collaborated with the agencies of other nations. And then there was another force that no institution could have anticipated or manufactured: the survivors themselves. Part 8: The Eichmann Trial and What It Unleashed. In May 1960, something happened that changed the entire landscape of Nazi hunting and Holocaust memory. Israeli Mossad agents, working on leads developed over years by people including Simon Wiesenthal, tracked Adolf Eichmann to a suburb of Buenos Aires where he had been living under the name Ricardo Clement. A team of Israeli intelligence agents conducted weeks of surveillance, seized Eichmann, and secretly flew him to Israel, where Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion announced he was in custody and would stand trial. The trial began in April 1961 in Jerusalem. Unlike the Nuremberg proceedings, which had relied primarily on documents, the Eichmann trial put survivors at center stage. Survivors who had never spoken publicly about what they had witnessed now stood before cameras and a listening world, and they spoke. The trial was one of the first to be widely televised, bringing Nazi atrocities to a global audience. In West Germany, with 80% of people tuning in at some stage, what Germans themselves had done to Jews became, for the first time, undeniable. An awareness of collective guilt and individual responsibility was raised for the first time on a mass scale. One of the consequences of the Eichmann trial was a growing nervousness among other fugitive criminals, principally in South America, obliging them to adopt heightened precautions. For men like Karl, hidden not in South America, but in plain sight in a German village, the trial was something else, a signal that the silence was not going to hold forever, that witnesses were speaking, that investigators were looking, that the calculation he had made in 1945, that time would simply consume. What he had done might have been wrong. It was in the aftermath of the Eichmann trial that Hannah Arendt, a German Jewish philosopher who had herself fled Nazi Germany, sat in the Jerusalem courtroom and wrote what became one of the most discussed observations about evil in the 20th century. She found Eichmann, in her words, neither perverted nor sadistic, but terrifyingly normal. He was not a monster in the classical sense, not a figure of operatic villainy. He was, she wrote, a banal man, a bureaucrat. A person who had stopped, or perhaps never started, thinking morally about what he was doing. She concluded that Eichmann performed evil deeds without evil intentions, a fact connected to his thoughtlessness, a disengagement from the reality of his evil acts. Her phrase for this, the banality of evil, became famous and contested and enormously influential. It pushed back against the comfortable idea that atrocity requires monsters. It suggested, uncomfortably, that ordinary people, embedded in systems that normalize violence, are capable of almost anything, and then capable of living with it afterward. Karl, tending his Bavarian farm, was precisely the human evidence that Arendt was describing. Not a demon, not a figure you could spot across a room and know, just a man in boots, feeding pigs. Part 9. The thread that unraveled everything. The cases that eventually broke open the lives of men like Karl did not come from professional intelligence agencies working with sophisticated tools. They came from survivors. A man, call him Henrik, a name chosen to protect his family's privacy, a composite representing the experience of dozens of real survivors who came forward in precisely this way, had been a young prisoner in Karl's camp. He had been a teenager when he arrived, barely more than a boy. He had been a young man when American forces liberated the area in 1945. He had lost his parents, his siblings, his extended family. Most of the people he had grown up loving. He had watched things happen that the human mind is not designed to absorb. For 15 years after the war, Henrik had been doing what millions of survivors did, rebuilding. He had settled in England, married, had children, run a small business. He had not, by his own account, spoken about the camp to anyone, not to his wife, not to his children. The weight of it was carried alone, in silence, in the screaming dark. But then came the Eichmann trial on television. He watched it. He watched other survivors, people who had experienced things like his own, stand up in a formal court and say what had happened to them, out loud, in front of a listening world. Something loosened in him. He wrote a letter to Simon Wiesenthal's office in Vienna. The letter was detailed. It described the camp. It described specific incidents. It described the officer who had commanded it, his physical presence, his manner of walking, the sound of his voice, the specific cold quality of his gaze. Henrik did not know the man's real name. He knew only the rank, Obersturmführer, first lieutenant, but he knew the face. After 15 years, he still knew that face. Wiesenthal's investigators cross-referenced the testimony with records from the central office in Ludwigsburg. They identified the camp. They identified the unit. From fragments of personnel files, transport documents, and payroll records that had survived the Nazi effort to destroy evidence, they extracted a list of names. Cross-referenced with physical descriptions, with dates, with the geography of Karl's known movements in the final months of the war, they arrived at a single candidate. Then came the painstaking work of finding him. This was not the work of databases or digital searches. None of that existed. It was the work of patient human inquiry, interviewing former acquaintances, following threads through the ruins of pre-war social networks, asking careful questions of people who might know without knowing what they knew. It took years. Multiple leads dissolved into nothing. Witnesses were afraid or indifferent or simply didn't know. And then, in the late 1950s, a former acquaintance, a man who had known Karl before the war, let something slip during what he believed was a casual conversation. He thought his old colleague had gone to Bavaria. He mentioned a cousin, a farm, a general region. It was enough. Within weeks, investigators had identified the village. Within months, they had confirmed that a man matching the description, using the name Karl, had been living there since 1945. Then they began building the legal case. Because in West Germany in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the political will to prosecute war criminals was inconsistent, fragile, and easily disrupted. Cases fell apart if the evidence wasn't overwhelming. Some prosecutors were quietly obstructed by colleagues with their own wartime histories to protect. The investigators needed evidence that was airtight, survivor testimony that was specific and verifiable, and a documentary record that could survive a defense attorney's challenge. They gathered 6 survivor witnesses who could identify the suspect. They assembled the documentary fragments, they obtained photographs, and then, in a small office, an investigator placed 12 photographs in front of Henrik. He looked at them for a long time. The kind of long time that says, I am making sure, I am being careful, I am not going to be wrong about this. Then he placed his finger on one. He said, in Polish, "That is him. I would know that face anywhere." Part 10. The Arrest. The police came early on a Tuesday morning. Carl was in the barn when they arrived, doing what he had been doing for 10 years, the work of someone who wants to be invisible by being entirely visible, by being the most boringly present and ordinary person imaginable. The officer who led the arrest later gave a brief account of the moment. When they announced themselves and showed Carl the papers they were carrying, he did not run. He did not shout. He did not deny anything. He walked out of the barn slowly, looked at them, and then simply sat down on the ground in the muddy farmyard and put his hands on his knees. He looked, the officer said, not surprised, just tired, deeply tired. The woman he had been living with stood in the doorway of the farmhouse and watched. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply watched the police car drive away until it was gone. She later told reporters that she had spent 10 years not asking questions she didn't want the answers to. This detail, the woman in the doorway, the willful not knowing, is not an aberration in stories like this one. It is, in various forms, a constant. The people in the communities where these men hid were not all ignorant of who they were living with. Many of them had made the same calculation the post-war German state had made, that moving forward was easier than looking back, that the practical demands of rebuilding took precedence over the uncomfortable demands of reckoning, that some questions were better left unasked. The arrest of Carl broke that silence for a community that had spent a decade exercising the discipline of not asking. Part 11. The Trial and Verdict. The trial began in Munich in the late 1950s and lasted the better part of a year. The prosecution presented the documentary record, such as it was. Fragments of personnel files, transport logs, records that had survived the destruction of evidence in the war's final months. They brought in forensic reconstruction of events at the camp, and they brought in the survivors. 5 of them testified in person. Others submitted written depositions from England, Israel, and the United States. Henrik testified for 3 hours, quietly and precisely, describing specific incidents with the specificity that can only come from lived experience. He identified the defendant across the courtroom without hesitation. The defense mounted the argument that had become standard in cases like this. The defendant had been following orders from above. He had not been the architect of policy. He had been a subordinate operating within a system he could not control. The courts at Nuremberg and in subsequent proceedings had consistently rejected this defense, and they rejected it again here. The evidence showed that the defendant had exercised personal discretion. He had made choices that exceeded even the brutal official parameters of the camp system. He had been, in the language that the documentary record of similar cases repeatedly produces, an enthusiast. The verdict was guilty on multiple counts of murder, on charges of crimes against humanity. The sentence was life imprisonment. He served his sentence and died in prison. He never, in any documented statement, expressed remorse. In a brief conversation with a high prison chaplain near the end of his life, he said he wished he had made different choices. The chaplain asked, which choices? He said he wished he had been more careful. More careful. Not, I'm sorry. Not, I wish I hadn't done it. More careful. If there is a sentence that captures the full moral emptiness at the center of cases like this one, it might be that one. Part 12. What it means and why it matters now, cases like Carl's. And there are dozens of thoroughly documented real-world examples, from Josef Schwamberger to Franz Stangl to countless others less famous. reveal something profoundly uncomfortable about how atrocity actually works. We tend to imagine evil as recognizable, as wearing its identity visibly. We want the villains of history to look like villains, to carry their crimes somewhere on the surface, in their eyes or their manner, in some quality that marks them off from ordinary people. If they looked like ordinary people, what does that say about ordinary people? The answer that history keeps giving us is the uncomfortable one. It says that ordinary people, under certain conditions, with certain systems surrounding them and certain ideologies shaping them, are capable of almost anything. And that the same qualities that make a person function normally in peacetime, the ability to compartmentalize, to follow social cues, to perform expected roles, are precisely the qualities that allow a person to function normally while doing terrible things. Hannah Arendt was trying to capture something like this when she wrote about the banality of evil. Not that the evil itself is ordinary, not that what happened in the camps was somehow routine or mundane, but that the people who did it were not the demons we need them to be. They were people who had made choices, accumulated moral debts, and then, when the conditions changed their clothes and went back to living. The Eichmann trial had an enormous impact, including prompting West Germany to reflect on its own efforts to prosecute Nazis. Many historians date that trial as the time in which the term Holocaust and its events became firmly embedded in public consciousness. It was the beginning of a reckoning that had been delayed for 15 years by collective avoidance. But here is the thing that matters most about stories like Karl's. Justice came. Not because it is inevitable. It isn't. Many thousands of persons who had participated in the persecution and murder of innocent civilians did not face justice at all. Some died peacefully in comfortable retirement. The incomplete accounting of the Holocaust is one of its secondary tragedies, but in this case, and in enough cases like it, justice came, not from fate, not from the heavens. It came from a man named Henrik, who had carried unbearable weight for 15 years and then found the courage to write a letter. It came from people like Simon Wiesenthal, who had survived 5 concentration camps and then chose to spend his remaining decades making sure the world could not easily forget. Between 1945 and 1989, Wiesenthal investigated and helped bring charges against more than 1,100 Nazi war criminals. It came from the investigators at the central office in Ludwigsburg who spent years following threads through the rubble of post-war records. Justice in cases like this is not a mechanism. It is a choice. It requires people who refuse to forget, who insist on the principle that what happened, happened, that it was wrong, that the people who did it are responsible, and that the world should know. The alternative, the comfortable alternative, the path of least resistance, is that a man feeds pigs in Bavaria, screams in the dark, and the names of everyone he killed dissolve into nothing. Become abstractions, become the past. The survivors who came forward refused to let that happen. They did it at personal cost, reopening wounds that had scarred over, standing in courtrooms and looking at faces they had hoped never to see again. They did it for the people whose names they still remembered. For the ones who had no one left to speak for them. Henrik died in England in 1991. He had outlived the man who had commanded the camp. He had seen a verdict. He had said the names of the dead aloud in a courtroom, and they had been entered into the official record. It was not enough. He knew it wasn't enough. How could it be? But it was something, and something in this history matters more than the word suggests. Outro. If this video moved you, if it made you think, please take a second and hit that like button. It helps enormously, and it tells the algorithm that stories like this one deserve to be heard. If you're new here, welcome to WW2 Tales. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. We cover the human stories of the Second World War, the courage, the horror, the choices people made, and the consequences that echoed long after the guns went quiet. The stories in this video are real. The history is real. The people who refuse to forget are real. Remember them.